Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, in light of the extent to which Kamala Harris was absolutely pounded in the second Democratic debate last week, let's talk about the subject for which she was most heavily criticized, prosecutorial misconduct. Now, you could argue that the bigger issue for which she was criticized was prosecutorial aggression, specifically aggressive criminal prosecutions for drug violations regarding marijuana. Now, I think that is a particularly sensitive area, especially among Democrats, and especially among young voters, whether Democrat or Republican. And personally, on that particular point, the part of the attack on Harris which was launched by Tulsi Gabbard was the allegation that after prosecuting 1,500 people for marijuana violations, she laughed when asked whether she ever smoked marijuana herself. That, by the way, is true. She was being interviewed on a morning radio program and laughed when asked about smoking marijuana in college. I think the reason people find that particular response so troublesome is it smacks of a double standard, as in, the criminal laws are for thee and not for me. The thing that stood out for me was the allegation that she refused to release exculpatory evidence that would have resulted in a wrongfully convicted man being released from death row. She refused until ordered to do so by the court. Now, various fact-checkers have questioned the fairness of Gabbard's attack for reasons including the fact that the state attorney general does not personally prosecute individual cases, and also the fact that the advanced DNA testing that the plaintiff's attorney in the death row case in question was requesting, and which the prosecuting attorneys in Harris's office opposed, which was eventually conducted, has not vindicated the defendant in question to date. Moreover, those sites have also pointed out that the additional allegation that Ms. Gabbard raised was the claim that Harris forced prisoners to serve beyond the end of their sentences to provide the state with cheap labor, and those sites questioned that claim. The situation in question arose because courts had ordered the state to release prisoners to relieve overcrowding. Attorneys in the Attorney General's office had argued to the court that they should be allowed to keep prisoners incarcerated rather than providing for the release to relieve overcrowding because they were needed to assist with fighting wildfires. Incidentally, Ms. Harris claims that she was appalled by that argument and ordered that it not be used any further after she found out about it. Regardless, that is a somewhat different situation than keeping prisoners past the ends of their sentences. Instead, it's keeping prisoners after the end of the early termination of their sentences. Incidentally, I would hope that the use of prisoners in fighting wildfires does not place them in physical jeopardy. Risking your life fighting a wildfire is a decision that brave firefighters make. It can't be something that you force upon a prisoner, at least not in America. But the allegation that Ms. Harris was an overly aggressive prosecutor when she was Attorney General of the state of California doesn't stop with the specific allegations that Tulsi Gabbard leveled during the debate. When I looked into these claims, I found something that bothered me even more. In an article in USA Today, on March 10, 2015, University of Tennessee law professor and founder of the blog Instapundit, Glenn Harlan Reynolds, penned an article entitled, "Prosecutors Protect Themselves First." In the article, he described prosecutorial conduct in the case of the People versus Efren Velasco Palacios that a California appellate court described as, quote, outrageous government misconduct, close quote. And I have to say that I agree with that characterization. The prosecuting attorney in that case produced a translated transcript of the defendant's interrogation to which he had added a fraudulent confession. As Professor Reynolds notes, the defense attorney got a copy of the audio tape of the interrogation but it, quote, ended abruptly, close quote. In Reynolds' words, the prosecutor eventually, quote, admitted to falsifying the transcript, presumably in the hopes of either coercing a plea deal or ensuring a victory at trial, close quote. That's outrageous. It's disgusting. The prosecutor's duty extends beyond representing the state. He or she is representing the interests of justice. And regardless of that duty, no attorney is allowed to falsify a transcript and submit it to the court. Upon learning of the prosecutorial misconduct, the judge dismissed the charges against the defendant. This is where Kamala Harris comes in. As Attorney General, she decided to appeal the decision to dismiss the charges. Let me state that again. An attorney in her office falsified a transcript by inserting a confession that wasn't there and then submitted it to the court. When the judge found out, he dismissed the charges against the defendant, and Kamala Harris appealed the decision. There are lots of reactions that I would expect from an ethically driven attorney general. For example, firing the attorney who falsified the transcript, requesting that the State Bar Association disbar him permanently, prosecuting him to the fullest extent of the law. What I don't expect is for the Attorney General to appeal the decision dismissing the charges. So, what was the key argument made by the state in that appeal? As Professor Reynolds points out, it was that inserting a fake confession in a transcript wasn't, quote, outrageous, close quote, because it didn't involve physical brutality. Wow. I've heard critics of Kamala Harris say that she is an ethically challenged politician who will do anything to win. Now, I get it. I don't know whether Kamala Harris is going to rebound from this attack, but I know to an absolute certainty that these attacks will keep coming. And when the specifics of the Velasco Palacios case start getting widely discussed, she's going to have real problems. One of the ways that Kamala Harris has been described is as the most like Barack Obama, because she can play to the left, but also play to the more heavily moneyed interests of Wall Street. To the extent those heavily moneyed interests were looking for a Democratic candidate, Harris's background on this and other cases may represent enough of a weakness that they look elsewhere. The obvious beneficiary on the Democratic side is Joe Biden. His performances have been far from impressive. But if his opponents collapse, as may happen to Harris, they don't have to be impressive. Beating Donald Trump, on the other hand, is a very different matter. I still stand by my prediction that Donald Trump will win re-election unless we go into a recession. If we go into a recession, all bets are off. Next topic. Prosecutorial Misconduct, Part 2. I don't usually follow up a subject with another topic which is essentially the same subject, but I'm going to make an exception because of the importance of the issue to the country and how much I personally care about it. Now, the conduct of the prosecuting attorney under Kamala Harris that I described in the last segment was indeed outrageous and despicable. And in thinking about the impact of that misconduct, you probably assume it falls simply on the accused. I would argue that the damage goes farther than that, because when prosecutors succeed by engaging in misconduct, it encourages misconduct in other cases. But even then, we're still talking about individual criminal cases. To understand just how widespread the impact from prosecutorial misconduct can be, try to wrap your head around this incredible fact. If not for prosecutorial misconduct, Obamacare would not have passed. For those of you who don't know this story, you're probably scratching your head and saying to yourself, what the heck is he talking about? Well, here's what I'm talking about. Do you remember that when Obamacare passed the Senate and 60 votes were needed to invoke cloture, which prevents a filibuster from stopping the bill, that the number of votes obtained to invoke cloture and consider the bill was exactly 60. And then, when the House bill was expected to be revised to address all sorts of practical and technical problems and sent over to the Senate for passage, that couldn't happen because Ted Kennedy passed away, and when the special election was held, incredibly, a Republican won. Scott Brown, running as the 41st Senate vote to stop Obamacare, was able to take the seat that had been held by a Kennedy in Massachusetts, a state that hadn't elected a Republican senator in 38 years, and was able to win by 110,000 votes. Now, if the House bill was sent to the Senate, it couldn't pass, because the Democrats would be one vote short of the 60 votes needed to invoke cloture and end debate. So instead, the House took up the bill the Senate had passed, complete with all the technical problems in it, passed it, and sent it to President Obama, who signed it. So how exactly did prosecutorial misconduct result in the passage of Obamacare? Do you remember Alaska Republican Senator Ted Stevens? He died in a plane crash in 2010. At that time, he was no longer a senator. He had held the Senate seat from 1968 to 2009, making him the longest-serving U.S. senator in history at the time. He lost his seat to a Democrat opponent after being convicted in a D.C. federal court for failing to report gifts on a gift disclosure form. The allegation had been that he received approximately $250,000 in remodeling services for his home from oil services company Vico Corporation. The charges were filed against him just 100 days before he was to stand for re-election. His attorneys pushed for a quick trial, seeking an acquittal as the only way he could win the election and continue to hold his seat. Unfortunately, the jury convicted him on October 27, 2008, and a few days later, not surprisingly, he lost his re-election bid. Few dispute that the popular senator would have won if he'd been acquitted. With Ted Stevens replaced by a Democrat, the Senate Democrats had 60 votes and were able to invoke cloture to end debate on the Senate Obamacare bill, which then passed and was sent to the House, which passed it and sent it on to President Obama. And what happened to Ted Stevens in the immediate aftermath of the conviction? He issued a news release stating, quote, "I will fight this unjust verdict with every ounce of energy I have," close quote. Stevens' attorney sent a letter to then Attorney General Michael Mukasey requesting an investigation into alleged repeated prosecutorial misconduct in the case. In the month after the conviction, one of the prosecution witnesses wrote to the judge telling them that he had falsely denied on the stand that he had an immunity deal in exchange for his testimony. He also said that the prosecutors had left him unsupervised in a room full of confidential documents in an effort to coach his testimony. Then the following month, an FBI special agent turned whistleblower and filed a complaint alleging that prosecutors had tried to hide a witness in the case and deliberately withheld evidence from the defense. He also alleged that an FBI agent was engaging in a relationship that was inappropriate with the key witness in the case. Then, when the judge oversaw discovery into the whistleblower allegations, the federal prosecutors failed to follow a court order, and 3 of them were held in contempt of court. The Justice Department then removed its own trial team and substituted new attorneys, who then found more evidence which should have been provided to the defense, but hadn't been. The judge was furious. In the end, the misconduct was so severe that the new Attorney General, Eric Holder, announced that the Justice Department would request that the indictment be dismissed. Judge Sullivan not only dismissed Senator Stevens' conviction, but he ordered a criminal investigation of the federal prosecution team. So bottom line, what was the most significant prosecutorial misconduct in this case? Senator Stevens had written a note to the founder of Vico Corporation, clearly directing him to prepare a bill for the chalet work, with a pretty clear direction not to understate the amount. Quote, "Friendship is one thing. Compliance with the ethics rules entirely different. I asked Bob P. to talk to you about this, so don't get PO'd at him. It just has to be done right." The note even referenced Robert Torricelli, the New Jersey senator who had been convicted of corruption for receipt of gifts. On its face, the letter appears to be saying, "Bill me correctly. I have to comply with my ethics obligations. Don't bill me less because I'm a friend." The note was the heart of the defense's case. The prosecutors contended it was a subterfuge intended to cover the senator's misdeeds. The recipient of that note said on the eve of trial that it wasn't meant to be followed, that Stevens really didn't intend to pay the bills. It appears that the jury believed him. They believed that explanation, that it was a subterfuge. But what the prosecutors didn't reveal to the defense is that the recipient of the note never made that claim in 55 previous interviews with the prosecutors and the FBI. They covered up an outrageous inconsistency. Only on the eve of trial did the prosecutor's star witness come up with the explanation that the note was never intended to be followed. The prosecutors also never disclosed that their star witness was the subject of an allegation of a sexual relationship with a 15-year-old girl who he purportedly asked to lie under oath about the allegation. They also never turned over statements from a renovation foreman which appeared to support the senator's account. And then the prosecutors submitted cost estimates that the criminal investigation ordered by the judge found to be wildly overblown. In the end, Ted Stevens was vindicated, but he'd lost his Senate seat. The country ended up with Obamacare. We can all argue about how good or bad it is, but if the federal government had conducted itself ethically in the prosecution of Ted Stevens, it would never have passed. The impact of prosecutorial misconduct goes far beyond the immediate players in each case. So how bad was the impact on the prosecutors? They weren't criminally charged. I think a good argument can be made that at least some of them should have been. 2 prosecutors were temporarily suspended by the Justice Department, but the impact on at least one prosecutor was extremely severe. Approximately 1 month after former Senator Ted Stevens died in the plane crash, while the criminal investigation of the prosecution team ordered by the judge was still underway, 37-year-old federal prosecutor Nicholas Marsh committed suicide. The Ted Stevens case is a truly sad one. I wish I could say that I was confident that nothing like it will ever happen again. Next topic. Trump exposing hypocrisy. As you know from listening to various episodes of this podcast, I've generally been quite impressed by what President Trump has been able to accomplish, especially while being subject to the most withering press attacks I've ever seen on any politician. But for all of the accomplishments which can be measured by traditional standards, such as passing the tax bill, rescinding numerous executive orders from the Obama administration, relocating the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, rescinding TPP, renegotiating NAFTA, etc., his greatest accomplishment may be something less traditional. On a daily basis, he's exposing the hypocrisy of the left, of much of the Democrat Party, and perhaps most of all, the news media. We can all argue about whether his tweets are a good idea. But the bottom line is if he wasn't tweeting, he'd have to rely on the news media to help carry his message to the people. Think about being in that position, trying to deliver a message to your constituents through a news media consisting primarily of people who think you are something just short of the Antichrist. How on earth could you possibly deliver your message through them? Well, President Trump has figured out how to do it. Say something that causes them to freak out, to label him as a racist or a transphobe or a homophobe or insane or unhinged or any other insult they can come up with. They do it virtually every time. And then Trump or his supporters just pull together the evidence showing how the media reacted differently when somebody else did or said the same thing. And once again, as the media attempts to show President Trump is unhinged, they fail, and instead proceed to show that they themselves are unhinged. Let's take the recent tweets from the president regarding Baltimore. He referred to Baltimore, most particularly Elijah Cummings' district, as a rat and rodent-infested mess. He later referred to it as a very dangerous and filthy place. He then referenced crime in Baltimore and noted that billions of dollars have been pumped into the city over the years, but with no effect. He stated that, quote, "the money was stolen or wasted. Ask Elijah Cummings where it went. He should investigate himself with his oversight committee," close quote. Trump also described Cummings' district as a place where, quote, "no human being would want to live," close quote. The tweets came after Representative Cummings had angrily attacked a representative of the Trump administration, Acting Homeland Security Chief Kevin McAleenan, during a House Oversight Committee hearing, asking whether the agency had an, quote, "empathy deficit," close quote. The president was almost immediately branded a racist. CNN made it a practice to consistently label the tweets as racist, as if that conclusion was so obviously correct it was not subject to dispute. They didn't ask the question of whether they were racist and then proceed to demonstrate why they believe they were. They simply labeled the tweets as racist and continued to use the label each time they referenced them. I believe that millions of Americans are sick and tired of the media conducting itself in this way. Even if they don't like many of President Trump's tweets, they also don't like the media concluding that racist is the proper label for them, rather than letting the public decide for itself. So if the media rushed to label the tweets and to roundly criticize the president and to rush to the defense of Baltimore and Congressman Cummings, what happened? People started finding things that showed the truth in much of what Trump had to say. For example, they learned about a documentary entitled Rat Film, which exposes the scale of Baltimore's rat infestation and the people who deal with it and fight it. The film was released in 2017, and as far as I can tell, nobody labeled the filmmakers racist for having produced it, and nobody labeled PBS as racist for showing it. People learned that the murder rate in Baltimore in 2017 was 10 times the national average, more than 10 times the national average in 2015, and nearly 10 times the national average in 2016 and 2018. President Trump had even said that the homicide rate in Baltimore is higher than in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. That certainly seems like an over-the-top claim. But incredibly, the homicide rate in those four countries is actually below that of Baltimore, and in Guatemala it's less than half that of Baltimore. Having said that, as PolitiFact points out, it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison because foreign homicide rates typically don't include death from armed conflicts. Regardless, the fact that the homicide rate in Baltimore is higher than in El Salvador and Honduras and twice that of Guatemala is stunning. What else did we learn? We learned that Bernie Sanders had previously referred to Baltimore as like a third world country. We learned that Elijah Cummings himself had referred publicly to his district as, quote, drug-infested, close quote. We know that much of the district qualifies as a slum or ghetto, and we've read about it and watched movies and television shows about the difficulties of living in slums and ghettos and the efforts of African American parents to get their kids out of those slums and ghettos. Nobody labeled the producers of those movies and television shows or the African American parents themselves as racist because of the message of those movies or the efforts of those parents. Once again, Trump played for the reaction, and he won. As the facts regarding prior statements by people like Bernie Sanders and documentaries like Rat Film came out, the media and the Democrats looked like hypocrites. Moreover, as Democrats jumped to the defense of Baltimore, they looked like they were defending failure, their failure, because like virtually every major urban area in the country, Baltimore has been under Democrat control for decades. Donald Trump has been trying to make inroads in the African American voting bloc. Back when Steve Bannon was on his team, Bannon made no secret of the fact that their plan was to gain 20% of the African American vote and 40% of the Hispanic vote. Now, I'm not saying they're going to achieve that. And one of the reasons I'm not saying that is that the media and the Democratic Party have been fighting tooth and nail to characterize President Trump as racist. and I don't know the extent to which that effort has succeeded among ordinary, everyday African Americans and Hispanics, as opposed to the politically active representatives you see at rallies and on cable news. But I do think there's a significant likelihood that President Trump will do better than expected among Hispanic voters, and to the great surprise of the media, African American male voters. Even reaching 20% support among African American male voters would be stunning, and it would be a serious threat to any Democrat chances to win. If you think the Democrats freak out now over things that President Trump says and does, think about how they'll react if it appears he's making inroads into their minority coalition. Now that would be fun to watch. And hopefully you'll continue to have fun by listening to Political Spirits. I'll be back next week with another episode for your enjoyment. Please tell your friends about Political Spirits, and remember to like Political Spirits Podcast on Facebook and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.